From a near-rejected lead actor to 3 separate trained rats, jaw-dropping age gaps between on-screen family members, and a musical score critics called Sesame Street leftovers, this troubled adaptation of Richard Wright's masterpiece hides bizarre production secrets that mirror its controversial subject matter. Prepare to discover the strange truth behind Hollywood's most uncomfortable literary adaptation. Fact 1. Oprah was only 3 years older than her son. When you watch Native Son from 1986, you might notice something a bit off about the family dynamics, and there's a good reason for that. Oprah Winfrey, who plays the struggling mother of the main character Bigger Thomas, was only 3 years older than Victor Love, the actor playing her adult son. That's right, just 3 years separated them in real life, which made for one of the most unusual casting choices in the entire production. In the film, Oprah's character is supposed to be a worn-down mother who has raised multiple children through poverty and hardship in 1930s Chicago, someone who looks like she's lived a hard life and aged beyond her years. Meanwhile, Victor Love was playing a young man in his early 20s who's just starting his adult life. The age gap between them should have been at least 20 years or more to feel authentic, but instead, it was barely enough to be siblings, let alone mother and son. Despite this awkward casting decision, both actors managed to pull off convincing performances that critics acknowledged. Oprah, who was still early in her acting career at this point and hadn't yet become the media powerhouse she is today, brought genuine emotion to the role of a desperate mother trying to keep her family together. Victor Love, in his film debut, delivered what many reviewers called a powerful and nuanced performance as Bigger Thomas. The Washington Post specifically praised both of their performances, even while other aspects of the film received criticism. It's one of those behind-the-scenes details that once you know about it, you can't unsee it when watching the movie. But somehow, the actors made it work through sheer talent and commitment to their roles. Fact 2. The star was initially rejected. Multiple times, Victor Love almost didn't get to play Bigger Thomas, and the reason why reveals some uncomfortable truths about Hollywood casting decisions. According to Love himself, the filmmakers repeatedly turned him down for the role because they didn't think his appearance and voice were, quote, street enough for the character. In other words, they were looking for someone who fit their preconceived notions of how a young black man from the impoverished South Side of Chicago should look and sound. The whole situation came about almost by accident. Love wasn't even auditioning for Native Son initially. He was trying out for a role in Othello, the Shakespeare play, which he didn't end up getting. During that process, someone called him in to read for the part of Bigger Thomas, but the filmmakers weren't convinced he was right for it. They rejected him, but something must have stuck with them because they eventually came back and offered him the role after all. Love had his own perspective on why he was cast despite the initial hesitation. He believed that author Richard Wright never actually intended for Bigger Thomas to be played in a completely unsympathetic way, but that Wright was simply afraid to ask audiences to care about a character who commits terrible acts. Love felt he could bring that complexity to the role, showing Bigger as a human being trapped by circumstances rather than just a stereotype. His gamble paid off professionally. The performance earned him a nomination for the Independent Spirit Award for Best Male Lead, and critics singled out his work as one of the film's strongest elements. Roger Ebert called it a powerful performance, proving that the filmmaker's initial concerns about Love not being street enough were completely unfounded. Fact 3. 3 trained rats for one famous scene. The opening scene of Native Son features one of the most memorable moments from Richard Wright's novel, where Bigger Thomas wakes up and has to kill a rat that's invaded his family's cramped apartment. What looks like a simple scene on screen actually required an impressive amount of behind-the-scenes animal coordination that most viewers would never guess. According to someone who was actually on set during the production, the filmmakers brought in 3 separate trained rats to pull off this single sequence, and each one had a very specific job to do. The first rat was trained to skitter across the floor in a menacing way, creating that initial sense of panic and chaos in the tiny room. The second rat was trained to cower in the corner, acting frightened and cornered as Bigger and his family try to trap it. And the third rat was used for the moment when Bigger finally kills the animal, though the person from the set made it clear that despite how it looks on camera, no rat was actually struck with a frying pan. They also mentioned being impressed by the rat wrangler, the professional animal handler who managed all 3 of these specially trained rodents. It's the kind of job most people don't even know exists in filmmaking, but it takes real skill to coordinate animals for specific actions on cue. The fact that the production put so much effort into getting one brief scene right shows how seriously they took staying faithful to the novel's most iconic moments, even if it meant hiring a specialist and working with multiple trained rats to make it happen. Fact 4. A major murder scene was filmed but never used. One of the biggest controversies surrounding the 1986 adaptation of Native Son involves a scene that was actually filmed but never made it into the final cut. The filmmakers shot footage of Bessie's murder, a crucial moment from Richard Wright's novel where the main character, Bigger, kills his girlfriend, but they never completed a version of the scene that satisfied them and ultimately decided to leave it out entirely. This decision sparked a major behind-the-scenes conflict between the creative team. Director Gerald Friedman strongly opposed cutting the scene and fought hard to keep it in the movie. He argued that the moment was pivotal to the entire story because it shows how Bigger Thomas completely falls apart psychologically, transforming from a victim of racism and poverty in 1930s Chicago into someone who victimizes others. Without that scene, Friedman felt the character's full descent couldn't be properly understood. On the other side of the argument, producer Diane Silver defended removing the murder by saying that the emotional complexity that worked so well in Wright's novel was simply impossible to translate to the screen. Another producer from American Playhouse, Lindsay Law, backed up this decision by explaining that audiences would completely disengage from Bigger as a character if they watched him deliberately kill his girlfriend, and that the book contained way more layers and nuance than could fit into a 2-hour film. Interestingly, Julia Wright, the daughter of author Richard Wright himself, sided with the producers on this one, stating that Victor Love's performance was strong enough that the murder scene wasn't actually necessary to convey Bigger's psychological state. Fact 5. The score was compared to Sesame Street leftovers. One of the most criticized aspects of Native Son was its musical score, which became a running joke among viewers and critics alike. The music was composed by James M. Toome, and one particularly harsh reviewer described it as sounding like, quote, leftovers from Sesame Street, adding that it didn't fit the tone at all and actually made serious dramatic scenes unintentionally humorous instead of impactful. The irony here is that James M. Toome was far from an amateur when it came to music. He was an incredibly accomplished artist in the R&B world who had written Grammy-winning hits and worked with major names in the music industry. His song, Juicy Fruit, became a massive hit in 1983, and he'd also won a Grammy for writing and producing Never Knew Love Like This Before for Stephanie Mills back in 1980. This wasn't someone who didn't know how to create compelling music. The problem was that M. Toome's style was deeply rooted in 1980s R&B, which meant heavy use of synthesizers and electronic keyboards that gave the music a very contemporary sound. Meanwhile, the film takes place during the Great Depression in 1930s Chicago, a setting that called for something much more period-appropriate and understated. That clash between the futuristic-sounding synth music and the historical setting created a jarring disconnect that pulled viewers out of the story. Multiple reviewers pointed out that the score was one of the worst parts of the entire production, with some saying it was so bad that it actually hurt the performances of the actors. The mismatch was so obvious that it became one of the most memorable things about the film, though unfortunately for all the wrong reasons. Fact 6. It featured future star Ving Rhames in one of his first film roles. If you watch Native Son closely, you'll spot a young actor who would go on to become one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, though you might not recognize him at first. Ving Rhames, who later became famous for playing Marcellus Wallace in Pulp Fiction and Luther Stickell in the Mission Impossible franchise, appears in a small supporting role as Jack, one of Bigger Thomas's friends from the neighborhood. This was actually Ving Rhames' very first theatrical film role, marking his debut on the big screen in 1986. At that point in his career, he was fresh out of the prestigious Juilliard School, where he had graduated with a fine arts degree in 1983 after studying classical acting. Right after graduation, he had been performing in Shakespeare in the Park Productions in New York, tackling challenging roles in plays like Richard III and other classical works that showcased his dramatic training. The path from classical theater to this small part in Native Son was just the beginning of what would become an incredibly successful career. Rames had also been picking up minor television roles around the same time, appearing in popular shows like Miami Vice and Crime Story, slowly building up his resume with whatever work he could find as a young actor trying to break into the industry. It would take another 8 years before he landed his breakthrough role in Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction in 1994, but Native Son represents an important early stepping stone in his journey. The film gave him experience working on a feature production and added a credit to his growing list of work as he developed his craft. Fact 7. The furnace scene drew unintentional laughs. One of the most crucial moments in Native Son is supposed to be deeply disturbing and horrifying, but instead it ended up making audiences laugh for all the wrong reasons. The scene where Bigger Thomas disposes of Mary Dalton's body in the basement furnace should have been one of the film's most intense moments, but the way it was filmed turned it into something almost comical. The main problem was that the scene went on way too long and showed way too much in a way that didn't make physical sense. One particularly blunt reviewer pointed out that the actress playing Mary, Elizabeth McGovern, is shown being pushed into a furnace that would be burning at around 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, yet her character doesn't react to the intense heat at all. The reviewer made the sarcastic comment that, quote, "No matter how drunk you are, you will react to 1200-degree flame no matter how bad you're acting," calling out the absurdity of the whole sequence. The reviewer went on to describe how the filmmakers really milked the scene, drawing it out and showing multiple angles of what was happening, which only made the unrealistic aspects more obvious to viewers. Instead of creating the sense of horror and panic that the moment called for, the extended focus on the gruesome details just highlighted how fake everything looked. The reviewer even called it, quote, "pure classic cinema," in a clearly sarcastic way, admitting they actually took satisfaction in watching the scene because of how ridiculous it had become. It's a perfect example of how trying too hard to be shocking or dramatic can actually backfire, turning a serious moment into something audiences remember as unintentionally funny instead of impactful. Fact 8. Geraldine Page made it. One of her final films, Native Son, holds a bittersweet place in film history as one of the last movies completed by legendary actress Geraldine Page, who played Peggy, the Irish housekeeper working for the wealthy Dalton family. Page was at the absolute peak of her career when she took on this small but memorable role, having just won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in The Trip to Bountiful in 1985. After finally winning that Oscar on her 8th nomination, which was a record at the time for the most nominations without a win, Page didn't slow down at all. She went straight back to work, completing Native Son in 1986 and then returning to her first love, which was live theater. In the fall of that same year, she took on the role of Madame Arcati in a Broadway revival of Noel Coward's play Blithe Spirit, earning yet another Tony Award nomination for her performance. Tragically, Page's time on stage would be cut short. In June of 1987, just months after Native Son was released, she failed to show up for 2 performances of Blithe Spirit. When people went to check on her, they found that she had died in her Manhattan apartment. She was only 62 years old. The Broadway show continued for several more weeks with her understudy taking over the role, but the theater world had lost one of its most respected and talented performers. Native Son represents one of the final chances audiences had to see Geraldine Page's work on film, making her appearance as the well-meaning but ultimately ineffective housekeeper a poignant reminder of a remarkable career. Fact 9. Everyone worked for scale to get the film made. One of the most surprising things about Native Son is how the production managed to attract such an impressive cast despite having a very limited budget of only $2 million. The answer lies in an unusual agreement that all the actors made before filming even began. Everyone would work for scale, which means they all accepted the minimum wage allowed by their union contracts, regardless of how famous they were. This meant that established stars like Oprah Winfrey, who was already becoming a household name after her Oscar-nominated performance in The Color Purple, and Matt Dillon, who had been a teen heartthrob in movies throughout the early 1980s, were getting paid exactly the same as unknown actors who were just starting their careers. According to someone who was actually on set during production, this arrangement came with a specific condition that made it more appealing to the bigger names. Since everyone was working for the same pay, all the cast members would have their names listed and credited evenly in the final film, with no one getting special billing above anyone else. This kind of arrangement is pretty rare in Hollywood, where actors' salaries and the size of their names on movie posters are usually a big deal, and often a source of negotiation and conflict. But for Native Son, it seems the cast was willing to set aside those usual concerns because they believed in the importance of Richard Wright's story and wanted to be part of bringing it to the screen. The equal pay and equal billing system created a sense of collaboration and shared purpose that allowed this ambitious adaptation to actually get made. Fact 10. Different strokes. Star had a supporting role. Among the cast of Native Son was a familiar face that television audiences would have recognized immediately from their living rooms. Shavar Ross, who played the lovable character Dudley on the popular sitcom Different Strokes, took on the role of Buddy, the younger brother of the main character, Bigger Thomas. For viewers in 1986, seeing Ross in this dramatic film would have been quite a shift from the light-hearted comedy they were used to watching him in every week. Different Strokes was one of the biggest sitcoms of the late 70s and 80s, running for 8 seasons and making its young cast members into household names across America. Ross played Dudley Johnson, the best friend of Arnold Jackson, and appeared regularly throughout the show's run. His character was known for getting into various misadventures with Arnold, and the show tackled serious issues through a comedic lens, including a very famous 2-part episode about child safety that became one of the most talked about moments in television history. Having Ross join the cast of Native Son gave the production another recognizable name that could help attract audiences, even though the film was working with a modest budget of just $2 million. His presence also showed that the filmmakers were committed to assembling the strongest possible ensemble, mixing established television stars, acclaimed theater actors, and talented newcomers to bring Richard Wright's powerful story to life. For Ross himself, it was an opportunity to show his range as a young actor by taking on a much more serious and dramatic role. Fact 11. Richard Wright's daughter praised the film despite its changes. When adapting a beloved novel to the screen, one of the biggest concerns is usually how the author's family will react to any changes made to the original story. In the case of Native Son, the filmmakers got a surprising seal of approval from someone whose opinion carried enormous weight. Julia Wright, the daughter of author Richard Wright, who had written the groundbreaking novel back in 1940. Julia Wright publicly praised the 1986 film adaptation, saying it showed, quote, honesty and respect for her father's book. What makes her endorsement particularly interesting is that she specifically defended one of the most controversial decisions the filmmakers made, which was cutting out the scene where Bigger Thomas murders his girlfriend, Bessie. This was a pivotal moment in the original novel that many critics and scholars considered essential to understanding how completely Bigger falls apart morally and psychologically. Julia Wright argued that Victor Love's performance as Bigger was so strong and nuanced that the murder scene simply wasn't necessary to convey the character's mental state and deterioration. She felt that Love was able to show all of that complexity through his acting without needing to include such a brutal and difficult moment. This put her in direct disagreement with the film's director, who had fought hard to keep the scene in, but it gave the producers important backing for their decision. It's worth noting that her father, Richard Wright, had specifically crafted Bigger Thomas to be an uncomfortable and unsympathetic character, and the murder of Bessie was part of that deliberate choice. Fact 12. The film only got a VHS release and was nearly lost. Despite having a cast that included Oprah Winfrey, Matt Dillon, and other recognizable names, Native Son had an extremely troubled distribution history that nearly caused it to disappear entirely. The film only received a VHS release when it came out, and for many years it never made the jump to DVD or any other modern format, making it incredibly difficult for people to find or watch. One film reviewer who finally managed to track down a copy years later wrote that they were, quote, 99% certain this one was buried by the studio upon release, suggesting that the distributor deliberately tried to minimize the film's exposure. The reviewer theorized that 1986 audiences simply weren't ready for the movie's heavy subject matter, which deals with accidental murder, racism, and social inequality in very direct and uncomfortable ways. The story centers on a young black man who accidentally kills a white woman and then tries to cover it up, knowing he won't receive a fair trial, and that kind of racially charged narrative was considered too risky for mainstream distribution. The film did eventually get re-released on VHS in 1994 and again in 1996, but these were limited releases that didn't reach many people. For decades, Native Son existed in a sort of limbo where film scholars and people interested in Richard Wright's work knew the movie existed, but had almost no way to actually see it. It became one of those lost films that people would talk about, but rarely got the chance to experience, which is especially unfortunate given the historical importance of the source material and the talent involved in the production. Fact 13. It aired on PBS 2 years after theatrical release. Native Son had one of the strangest release patterns you'll ever see for a movie, which really shows how confused the distribution strategy was from the very beginning. The film first came out in theaters in December of 1986 with a very limited release, meaning it only played in a small number of movie theaters across the country. Then, after that brief theatrical run ended, audiences had to wait almost 4 full years before they got another chance to see it when it finally aired on PBS as part of their American Playhouse series on April 4th, 1990. That massive gap between the theatrical release and the television broadcast is pretty unusual and points to just how much trouble the film had finding its audience. What makes this situation even stranger is that Native Son was actually produced by American Playhouse in the first place, which was a PBS program known for making high-quality television movies and occasionally giving them limited theatrical releases before bringing them to TV. But in this case, the process seemed to work backwards or get completely jumbled up. Most American Playhouse productions would have a quick turnaround from theaters to television, maybe a few months at most, so that viewers who missed the theatrical run could catch it relatively soon on PBS. But Native Son sat in limbo for years, unavailable in theaters and not yet on television, creating this weird period where the film essentially vanished from public view. When it finally did air on PBS in 1990, it had been so long that many viewers probably didn't even remember that it had been in theaters at all. Fact 14. Communism references were deliberately muted. The filmmakers made some significant changes to Richard Wright's original story beyond just cutting out violent scenes, and one of the most important alterations involved downplaying the political themes that were central to the novel. According to a report in the Los Angeles Times, the emphasis on communism in the screenplay was deliberately, quote, muted compared to the book, softening what Wright had intended to be a major part of the story. In the original 1940 novel, Communist Party organizers play a crucial role in Bigger Thomas's life after he's arrested for murder. They're portrayed as the only white people who genuinely try to help him and treat him as a human being rather than a criminal or a stereotype. Wright, who was himself involved with the Communist Party, during that period of his life, used these characters to make a pointed political statement about who was actually fighting for racial justice in Depression-era America. The novel includes lengthy sections where communist lawyer Boris Max delivers passionate speeches about systemic racism and economic inequality. The film version still includes the character of Jan, Mary Dalton's boyfriend who has leftist political views. And there's still a lawyer who defends Bigger, but the explicitly communist elements are toned way down. The filmmakers reduced the political messaging and cut out most of the ideological content, presumably because they worried that American audiences in the mid-1980s, during the Cold War era, wouldn't respond well to a story that portrayed communist organizers in a sympathetic light. This decision fundamentally changed one of Wright's key arguments about race, class, and who really supported Black Americans during that historical period. Fact 15. The famous real-life Chicago mansion was used for filming. While Native Son was made on a tight budget and faced many production challenges, the filmmakers did manage to secure one impressive location that added real authenticity to the movie. They filmed the scenes at the wealthy Dalton family's home using an actual historic mansion in Chicago called the Martin A. Ryerson House, located at 4851 South Drexel Boulevard. This wasn't just any random house they picked for convenience. The Ryerson House is a genuine piece of Chicago architectural history that perfectly captured the kind of upper-class wealth and privilege that the Dalton family represents in the story. Using a real mansion from the Wright neighborhood helped ground the film in the actual geography and social landscape of Chicago, which was important since the city itself is almost like another character in Richard Wright's novel. The stark contrast between the mansion and the poor tenement where Bigger Thomas lives with his family becomes much more powerful when you're seeing real locations rather than studio sets. The production filmed at this location and around Chicago between March 17th and April 25th of 1986, giving them about 5 weeks to capture all the footage they needed. This relatively short filming schedule was typical for a low-budget production, and the crew had to work efficiently to get everything done on time. Having access to an authentic historic home like the Ryerson House probably saved them time and money compared to building elaborate sets, while also giving the film a visual richness that helped it feel more connected to the real Chicago that Richard Wright wrote about in his groundbreaking novel.